The American Revolution. The ultimate colonial breakup saga. Picture this. 13 colonies tired of being ghosted, overtaxed, and micromanaged by the British Crown decide it's time for a breakup. Thus began the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. A drama-packed showdown that turned "no taxation without representation" into the ultimate breakup anthem. Spoiler alert. The colonies went from "it's complicated" to full independence, forming the United States of America. The Prelude. When neglect becomes a problem. For years, Britain had a "you do you" policy toward its colonies, also known as salutary neglect. But after racking up some hefty debts, thanks French and Indian War, Britain started treating its colonies like a wallet with legs. Cue taxes, trade restrictions, and a serious case of colonial side-eye. By 1775, things got so tense that shots were fired in Lexington and Concord. The colonies had officially entered their "we're done here" phase. When it's not just you and me, an international affair. At first, the revolution was just a messy family feud within the British Empire. But by 1778, France, still bitter about its last breakup with Britain, slid into the colonies' DMs. "Need a hand?" France asked. By 1779, Spain joined in too, and even the Netherlands hopped on board, providing cash and recognition for the colonies. Britain suddenly found itself dealing with a full-blown group intervention. Not a great year for King George III. Sea power. The Og power move. The ocean wasn't just for vibes. It was the war's ultimate chessboard. Britain used its navy to maintain control and compensate for its relatively small land forces. But then the French flexed their sea power, particularly at Yorktown in 1781, where they helped trap the British Army like a lobster in a pot. That was game over for Britain, and the final peace treaty came in 1783. The Armies. Ragtag rebels versus Redcoat professionals. Team America. The colonists were basically working with two squads: the Continental Army, the varsity team, and the state militias, the scrappy JV squad. Numbers were always a problem, with the Continental Army struggling to stay above 20,000 troops at any given time. Why? Farmers didn't want to leave their fields. Inflation made paychecks worthless, and honestly, no one was hyped about long-term service. Think. Enthusiastic volunteers who ghosted after 3 months. Team Britain. Meanwhile, Britain fielded about 42,000 well-trained professionals. These guys weren't exactly there by choice, though. Many were farm boys, unemployed city folk, or people dodging fines and jail time. The officers? A mix of aristocrats and gentry who bought their way into the gig. While the soldiers were disciplined and efficient, the generals had a reputation for being either too cautious or too impulsive. Basically, they were the Goldilocks of bad military decisions. The aftermath. Freedom achieved, but not without chaos. When the dust settled, the colonies had pulled off the ultimate underdog win. The revolution wasn't just about muskets and militias. It was about people daring to dream of self-rule, even if it meant countless sacrifices, endless debates, and the occasional questionable decision. So, the American Revolution wasn't just a war, it was the ultimate DIY nation-building project. And while it had its fair share of messiness, it proved that sometimes, breaking up is the best way to grow up. The British bring in backup. Rent a troop gone wrong. The British, short on soldiers and allergic to conscription, decided, why recruit when you can rent? So, they outsourced their army, buying about 30,000 German mercenaries, mainly from the Landgrave of Hesse. Because who doesn't love a good side hustle? This move made the American colonists furious, screaming, "Oh, now it's a foreign invasion?" The mercenaries didn't exactly win hearts or minds. Trouble brewing in Massachusetts. The rebellion's tinderbox. King George III had Massachusetts pegged as the ringleader of all this colonial drama. After the Boston Tea Party, because who doesn't love a good protest over overpriced tea, Parliament hit back with the Intolerable Acts in 1774, a series of punitive laws designed to spank the colony into submission. Spoiler: it didn't work. Massachusetts' elected council was swapped out for a military government under General Thomas Gage, who came with 4 regiments, about 4,000 troops, and a whole lot of overconfidence. British officials in London dismissed the colonists as nothing more than a rude rabble, with no clue how to plan or fight. Gage, on the ground, begged to differ, estimating it would take at least 20,000 troops to handle the situation. Unfortunately for Gage, Britain handed him a butter knife and asked him to cut through steel. Colonial mischief, powder, Paul Revere, and preemptive strikes. Gage's strategy? Shut down the colonial prep work by snatching their weapons and gunpowder. But the colonists, now veterans of British micromanagement, were always a step ahead. The Sons of Liberty and Committees of Correspondence were basically the 18th century version of a high-tech spy network, leaking British plans like tomorrow's weather forecast. When word spread that the British were eyeing the weapons stockpile at Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston's Committee of Correspondence sent out the colonial Batman, Paul Revere. On December 13, 1774, Revere delivered the warning, and the next day, a few hundred colonials stormed the undermanned fort. The result? 6 British soldiers were humiliated. The colonists made off with powder and cannons, and the British flag got unceremoniously yanked down. This open act of defiance had British officials fuming, but they couldn't keep up with the colonists' game of hide and seek with arms and ammunition. Supplies were squirreled away in homes, hidden in barns, and probably under some guy's hat. The big mistake: underestimating the underdogs. By April 1775, the British had officially declared Massachusetts in a state of open revolt, ordering Gage to arrest the leaders of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. But, plot twist, the colonials already knew what was coming. With eyes and ears everywhere, Gage's every move was practically live-streamed to rebel leaders before it happened. The stage was set for the inevitable clash at Lexington and Concord, where the colonials would show that rude rabble could pack a punch. In the end, Gage learned the hard way that even 4,000 professional troops couldn't outmaneuver a scrappy network of farmers, blacksmiths, and candlemakers with a cause. And thus, the American Revolution rolled into full gear, proving that when you underestimate a rude rabble, you might just lose an empire. Paul Revere's Ride, the original Midnight Messenger. On April 16, 1775, Paul Revere saddled up and rode to Concord, sounding the colonial alarm. Hide your muskets, hide your powder, the British are coming. Fast forward 2 nights, and Revere's midnight ride kicks into high gear. The local Sons of Liberty flashed their 2-lantern signal from Boston's Old North Church, confirming the British were crossing the Charles River. Revere, joined by William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, dashed off to Lexington to spread the word. But it wasn't all smooth galloping. The trio ran into a British patrol, and while Dawes and Prescott managed to escape, Revere was briefly captured. Pro tip: if you're going to warn the colonies, maybe avoid the Redcoats. Prescott completed the mission, and Revere's ride became legendary, thanks to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poetic PR campaign. The battles of Lexington and Concord: shots, skirmishes, and snipers. On April 18, 1775, about 700 British troops lined up on Boston Common, loudly preparing to march to Concord. Subtlety wasn't their strong suit. By the time they waded through waist-deep swamp water, a charming start to their trek, and arrived in Lexington at dawn, the colonists were ready for them. On Lexington Green, 77 Minutemen faced off against the British forces. Both sides shouted, "Don't shoot!" And then someone, still a mystery, fired the infamous shot heard round the world. 8 colonists were killed, and the rest scattered. The British marched on to Concord, but this time they met stiff resistance from hundreds of militia members who'd had their morning coffee. Outnumbered and running low on ammo, the British were forced into a chaotic retreat back to Boston, harassed the entire way by colonial sharpshooters. Final score: 273 British casualties versus 95 for the Americans. Lesson learned? Don't underestimate angry farmers with muskets. The Siege of Boston and the Battle of Bunker Breeds Hill. After Lexington and Concord, Colonial militias swarmed Boston like it was Black Friday at a musket sale. General Gage, now sweating bullets, called for reinforcements. Enter British generals Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne, plus Charles Cornwallis for good measure. Basically, the British Empire's greatest hits. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia decided it was time to get organized, voting for defensive measures and putting George Washington in charge of the rebellion. Washington didn't even have time to unpack before Gage ordered an attack on rebel positions around Boston. The Americans, cheeky as ever, decided to dig in on Breeds Hill, not Bunker Hill, despite what the name suggests. The British, not thrilled about the possibility of Colonial artillery raining on Boston, launched a frontal assault on June 17, 1775. Howe's 2,300 Redcoats charged up the hill 3 times, facing brutal musket fire from behind American fortifications. The British finally overran the position, but not before losing more than 40% of their troops, a costly win. The Americans? They may have lost the hill, but they walked away with their morale sky high. Lesson learned for the British: frontal assaults are overrated. Takeaway: a war heating up. By now, the revolution was in full swing, and the British were learning that taming the colonies wasn't as easy as it looked on paper. With a mix of daring midnight rides, scrappy militias, and strategic high ground, the Americans proved they were ready to fight tooth and nail for their independence. This was only the beginning of a long and chaotic breakup. Stay tuned for more plot twists, betrayals, and some French intervention to spice things up. Washington takes the helm. The man, the myth, the general. On July 3, 1775, George Washington arrived in Cambridge, donned his best, business, face, and took command of the ragtag American forces. His first job? Keep the British bottled up in Boston while turning the makeshift militias into an actual army. Easier said than done. Recruitment numbers were so low that Washington probably considered offering free muskets and a continental breakfast to new recruits. Enter General Henry Knox, a man with a dream, a sled, and a whole lot of determination. Over the winter, Knox hauled artillery from Fort Ticonderoga, captured earlier by the Green Mountain Boys, led by Colonel Ethan Allen, a guy who made even Green Mountain sound tough. Knox's epic delivery of cannons to Dorchester Heights above Boston in early 1776 gave Washington the firepower to force General William Howe, who'd replaced the unlucky Gage, to pack his bags and sail off to Halifax on March 17, 1776. Boston was free, and Washington turned his attention to the next big British target, New York. Canada. Great ideas, terrible outcomes. Meanwhile, things were getting frosty, literally, up north. In late 1775, the Americans, feeling ambitious, decided to invade Canada. General Richard Montgomery captured Montreal on November 13, and Benedict Arnold, before his infamous betrayal, led a grueling march through the Maine wilderness to Quebec. Spoiler: it didn't go well. Their joint attack on Quebec failed miserably on New Year's Eve, leaving Montgomery dead, Arnold wounded, and a bunch of troops either captured or wishing they'd stayed home. The Americans tried to keep the siege going, but smallpox and British reinforcements ruined their winter plans. By spring, it was clear Canada wasn't joining the rebellion, so the battered Americans limped back to Fort Ticonderoga. Adding to the chaos, British General Guy Carleton wanted to swoop down Lake Champlain, but Arnold, still one of the good guys at this point, pulled a fast one by building a makeshift fleet. Carleton had to build his own fleet, finally smashing Arnold's in October 1776, but winter came too soon for him to push further. The Canadians stayed Canadian, and everyone chalked it up as a learning experience. Southern skirmishes. Rebels hold the line. While the Americans were having a rough time up north, the southern colonies were making waves. On February 27, 1776, North Carolina rebels gave Loyalists a sound thrashing at Moores Creek Bridge, proving that Southern hospitality didn't extend to British sympathizers. Then in June, Patriots in Charleston, South Carolina, fended off a British naval assault, thanks to a fort built from palmetto logs, nature's original shock absorber. The Battle for New York, Washington's toughest gig. By summer 1776, Britain was done playing nice. The Howe brothers, Gen. William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe, arrived in New York with a massive fleet, 34,000 British and German troops, and a lot of attitude. Their idea of peace talks? Surrender now, and maybe we won't be too mean about it. Not surprisingly, the Continental Congress wasn't interested. Washington, ever the optimist, had already moved his army to New York and started fortifying the city. Unfortunately, the geography wasn't on his side. His left flank stretched across the East River, while the rest of his forces clung to Manhattan. The British, masters of all things nautical, easily outmaneuvered him. Through a series of well-planned attacks, the British forced Washington to abandon Manhattan Island entirely. It was a strategic nightmare for the Americans, but Washington's skill at retreating, an often overlooked military talent, kept his army alive to fight another day. Takeaway: victories, setbacks, and strategic retreats. As 1776 unfolded, the revolution was hitting its stride. Washington proved he could hold his own, even in the face of overwhelming odds. From clever cannon placements in Boston to hard-learned lessons in Canada and New York, the Americans were shaping up to be more than just a ragtag rebellion. Britain, meanwhile, was starting to realize that putting down this uprising wasn't going to be a walk in the park. The Battle of New York, from bad to worse. August 22, 1776. General William Howe, supported by his brother's naval firepower, landed 15,000 troops on Long Island, swelling to 20,000 by August 25. A few days later, on August 27, Howe crushed the American forces in the Battle of Long Island, forcing them into their Brooklyn defenses and inflicting heavy losses of around 1,400 troops. But Washington wasn't about to hand over his entire army. In a daring move, he used a thick fog as cover to evacuate his troops to Manhattan overnight, pulling off a strategic retreat that saved the revolution for another day. Manhattan falls, but Washington stays on the move. Howe kept up the pressure, invading Manhattan on September 15. The Americans managed to hold their ground briefly at Harlem Heights, but Howe's movements soon forced Washington to retreat. By October, Washington had pulled his troops off Manhattan entirely, leaving garrisons at Fort Washington and Fort Lee to guard the Hudson River crossings. Things got worse. On October 28, Howe defeated Washington at Chatterton Hill near White Plains. Then, in a devastating blow on November 16, Howe captured Fort Washington, along with its supplies, guns, and 3,000 prisoners. A week later, Lord Cornwallis took Fort Lee and began driving the Americans across New Jersey, leaving Washington's army battered and barely holding together. A Christmas miracle. Despite the crushing defeats, Washington wasn't giving up. On Christmas night, 1776, he launched a bold counterattack. With 2,400 troops, he crossed the ice-filled Delaware River and surprised the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn. The result? Nearly 1,000 Hessians captured and a much-needed morale boost for the Continental Army. Cornwallis tried to corner Washington by retaking Trenton on January 2, 1777, but Washington had other plans. Slipping away under cover of darkness, he struck British reinforcements at Princeton the next day, securing another victory. These wins, known as the Trenton-Princeton Campaign, re-energized the American cause and proved that the revolution was far from over. A British plan unravels United Kingdom. In 1777, Britain hatched a plan to isolate rebellious New England by having General John Burgoyne march south from Canada to link up with Howe on the Hudson River. But Howe had other ideas. Believing Burgoyne could handle things alone, Howe left New York and took his army by sea to Chesapeake Bay, aiming to capture Philadelphia. Washington tried to stop Howe at Brandywine Creek on September 11, but the British scored another victory, forcing the Continental Congress to flee the American capital. On September 25, Howe entered Philadelphia triumphantly. Washington struck back at Germantown on October 4, but the attack failed, and his army withdrew to Valley Forge for the winter. Cold, hungry, and under-equipped, the Continental Army faced its darkest days. Yet, even in these bleak circumstances, the seeds of resilience were being planted. The revolution endures. Despite losses and hardships, the Americans weren't down for the count. Washington's strategic retreats, surprise attacks, and ability to keep the army together proved critical. Meanwhile, the British, bogged down by miscommunications and divided strategies, were starting to realize that winning this war might be harder than expected. The Northern Campaign. Burgoyne's blunders and Saratoga's triumph. In 1777, British General John Burgoyne set out to crush the American rebellion by cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. His plan? March south to Albany with 9,000 troops made up of British regulars, German mercenaries, indigenous allies, and loyalists. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Berry Street Leger would converge on Albany via the Mohawk Valley. Burgoyne's campaign got off to a strong start, capturing Fort Ticonderoga on July 5. But instead of using the faster route along Lake George, he chose a difficult overland path, slowed by rugged terrain and fallen trees placed by Americans under General Philip Schuyler. Desperate for supplies, Burgoyne sent German troops to raid Bennington, Vermont, but on August 16, they were decisively defeated by New England militia under General John Stark and Colonel Seth Warner. Meanwhile, St. Leger's campaign collapsed. His forces besieged Fort Schuyler, present-day Rome, New York, and ambushed American militia at Oriskany on August 6, but they retreated as General Benedict Arnold approached with reinforcements. Burgoyne finally reached the Hudson River, but his troubles weren't over. American forces under General Horatio Gates, with key leadership from Arnold, clashed with him at Freeman's Farm on September 19 and decisively defeated him at Bemis Heights on October 7. With no reinforcements coming from New York, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army at Saratoga on October 17, 1777. France joins the fight. France. Burgoyne's defeat at Saratoga was a turning point in the war. France, which had been secretly supplying the Americans since 1776, now openly declared war on Britain in June 1778, sending fleets and troops to aid the revolution. The winter at Valley Forge. While the Northern victories boosted morale, Washington's army endured a brutal winter at Valley Forge, 1777–78. Poor management, corruption, and farmers unwilling to trade supplies for worthless paper money left the troops starving and freezing. Relief came in the form of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who drilled the soldiers in discipline, marching, and effective use of firearms. His efforts paid off in June 1778 at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, where Washington's improved army stood its ground against the British under Sir Henry Clinton, who had replaced General Howe. The battle also saw the rise of Molly Pitcher, a legendary figure who is said to have taken over her husband's cannon when he was injured. Setbacks and raids in the North. The war in the North stalled into a stalemate, with both sides raiding towns and forts. Key American successes included Mad Anthony Wayne's capture of Stony Point, New York, on July 16, 1779. Light Horse Harry Lee's victory at Paulus Hook, New Jersey, on August 19, 1779. Meanwhile, Sullivan's 1779 expedition against British-aligned indigenous allies in New York destroyed villages and farmland, weakening British support on the frontier. In the West, Colonel George Rogers Clark captured Kaskaskia in the Illinois Territory and retook Vincennes from British General Henry Hamilton, securing the Ohio Valley for American settlers. Treachery and mutiny. The American cause faced internal challenges as well. In 1780, General Benedict Arnold attempted to betray West Point to the British, but his contact, Major John Andre, was caught and executed as a spy. Army mutinies in 1780 and 1781, driven by poor pay, harsh conditions, and confusion over enlistment terms, were suppressed, but they revealed cracks in American morale. Southern campaigns and Cornwallis' surrender. The British shifted their focus to the south, hoping to exploit Loyalist sentiment. By early 1779, they had captured Georgia and defended Savannah against a Franco-American siege, during which Polish hero Kazimierz Pulaski was mortally wounded. Despite setbacks, the tide would eventually turn in the south, setting the stage for the dramatic final act of the Revolution at Yorktown. The Southern Campaign. The tide turns in the Revolution. After failing to secure a decisive victory in the north, British General Sir Henry Clinton turned his attention south in late 1779, leading a combined military and naval force. In December, he sailed with 8,500 troops to join General Augustine Prevost in Savannah, Georgia, accompanied by Lord Cornwallis and later reinforced by Lord Rawdon. The fall of Charleston. By May 12, 1780, Clinton's army had surrounded Charleston, South Carolina, forcing General Benjamin Lincoln to surrender. This was a devastating loss for the Americans, with 5,000 Continental troops captured, virtually the entire Southern Army. With Charleston secured, Clinton returned to New York in June, leaving Cornwallis in charge of British operations in the South. The fight for the Carolinas. Cornwallis swiftly took the offensive. August 16, 1780. Cornwallis crushed General Horatio Gates' army at Camden, South Carolina. Among the casualties was Johann de Kalb, a German officer in the Continental Army. October 7, 1780. At Kings Mountain, South Carolina, American militia destroyed a Loyalist force, inspiring renewed hope for the Patriots. Cornwallis turned his attention to the new American commander, General Nathanael Greene, who divided his forces to maximize flexibility. Greene dispatched General Daniel Morgan, who won a stunning victory at Cowpens on January 17, 1781, annihilating Colonel Banastre Tarleton's cavalry column. Guilford Courthouse and the retreat to Virginia. On March 15, 1781, Cornwallis faced Greene at Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina. Though Cornwallis technically won, his army suffered heavy losses. Weakened, he withdrew to Wilmington before marching north into Virginia. Guerrilla warfare in the South. While Cornwallis moved north, Greene focused on retaking the Carolinas. Though defeated in pitched battles at Hobkirk's Hill, April 25, and Eutaw Springs, September 8, Greene's relentless campaign, combined with guerrilla warfare led by Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, forced the British to retreat to coastal strongholds in Charleston and Savannah. Cornwallis in Virginia. Cornwallis reached Petersburg, Virginia, on May 20, 1781, and began a campaign to secure British control. His cavalry commander, Tarleton, raided as far north as Fredericksburg and west to Charlottesville, where Governor Thomas Jefferson narrowly avoided capture. Cornwallis entrenched his forces at Yorktown, expecting support from the British Navy. The Siege of Yorktown and British surrender. In September 1781, the tables turned. The Comte de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake Bay with a powerful French fleet and 3,000 troops, cutting off British escape by sea. General George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau marched their Franco-American army south from New York, joining forces with Lafayette near Yorktown. By mid-September, Yorktown was under siege. With no relief in sight, Cornwallis surrendered his army of 7,000 troops on October 19, 1781, marking a decisive American victory. For the second time, the British had lost an entire army. The end of the war. After Yorktown, large-scale fighting in America ceased, though skirmishes continued overseas and at sea. British evacuation began. July 11, 1782, the British abandoned Savannah. December 14, 1782, they left Charleston. November 25, 1783, the last British troops left New York, and Washington re-entered the city in triumph. The Revolutionary War officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, securing American independence.